So one block that we have to speak about is in the brain, to summarize a little bit of the functions, what we know. So we will investigate, as I call it, brain levels or brain tiers. The idea here is that we have certain structures in the brain that are responsible for certain behavior, and in particular the topology, the organization, the wiring of individual neurons plays an important role, and that has created already knowledge on different levels. And in order to sum that up a little bit, I've created this tier structure. So on the most fundamental level, we have the individual neuron. We know a lot about the neuron these days. One thing, for example, we know is that there are different types. We are mostly interested in interneurons, but there are also motor neurons and receptor cells. There are, of course, different forms of firing patterns. One sort of neuron might be more tonic, another one might be more excitatory. There are different types of synapses, in particular inhibitory and excitatory. There's different form of weighting and decay, so the potential is sometimes lost more quickly and then more slowly. There are different types of speed. They are purely electric neurons when it comes to reflexes. In the older parts of the brain, there's fast propagation and a slower form of propagation, depending on what kind of neurochemical processes are employed. So this is certainly different. Another thing that is also different in the neurons is the purpose of a particular neuron, or the position in the brain, whether it's, for example, part of the cerebellum executing some motor control function, or it's part in the cortex executing some semantically more or less loaded process, or being of some pathway in the processing. Okay, so that is the level of the individual neuron. On the other hand, on the other end, we actually have very complex patterns which we shall now call functions in the brain. Functions would, for example, be the expression of willpower. Another function might be, for example, language processing and understanding. Other functions might include touch perception and many other more. So there are many very complex things, and these happen actually in centers of the brain. Between the two, we have an interesting area of, as I would call that, neural groupings. Towards basic patterns or complex patterns. A simple yet very important form of neural grouping would, for example, be the gateway pattern. A gateway could, for example, be used in order to let information pass. If we have an input X and a stimulation Y, a gateway could simply implement it by an inhibitory neuron that performs a block on the input sequence. We have that, for example, in the on-off ganglion cells. So that is one pattern that floats around in this area. Another pattern would be that two neurons actually keep stimulating each other in a tonic fashion. So if input comes into one of them, they keep up the input and thus create a constant output through tonic firing patterns, and that would then be, so to say, a slow decay pattern. The two together can be used to form a more advanced pattern, like for example for language understanding or for grammar analysis. If you consider input neurons that already carry notion about different types of verbs, of words like the verb and the noun and so on, and you want to bring them in a particular sequence, then it would be imaginable that you have actually a slow decay pattern that is triggered by the noun, and this slow decay pattern inhibits through a gate pattern the verb, and only when the verb also arrives we generate an output signal here, breaking the inhibition through the through the slow decay pattern, and then creating an output that we now have actually a sentence. By using these two patterns, slow decay and the gate, we can force that the noun comes first, being the subject then, and the word then being the predicate comes second, and thus we conclude on a sentence. That would be already a more complex pattern that could be implemented in later stages. Even more complex patterns might include, for example, rhythm detection, random generations, generation of sleep patterns, and so on. And in the very, or actually far advanced, the already mentioned in the psychophysical part, the central pattern generators. That come later in the cerebellum after the motor cortex, when it is actually about acting. So, what do we have here? These are forms of neural grouping of individual complex patterns. Okay, let me zoom that out a bit if I can. No, I cannot. Okay, then we have to go like this. So, what we have here is, in my opinion, an order. And this order follows certain rules. We're going from the individual, from the simpler, so to speak, to the more complex. From the individual neuron to the functions, over patterns that are likely or that even have been identified already in the brain. So, what can we learn from that? One thing for sure we can learn is that apparently topology matters. So it's a lot about topology. Topology is knowledge. And knowledge in the brain always comes from experience, from learning. That is where we have that. So the actual information in the brain is in the grouping of the neurons. Of course, we have two fundamental forms of grouping, one being the pathway, the pipeline, the processing chain, and the other one being the center. Here I think we have a nice analogy to what we have in artificial neural networks, where pathways are actually what is happening in a convolutional layer in a deep network, and the center is what is happening at the end, for example, in a softmax classification, where different areas of input are actually aggregated, hypotheses are formed on different classes, and for example, the one with the maximum probability wins and is selected as the class describing the input pattern. Whereas the convolutional layers only have connections on the local level on, for example, a 3x3 or 5x5 neighborhood. And thus do processing step by step on the input data that fills the input layer. Okay, so to sum up, the brain tiers is an idea that I had in order to structure what we already know in terms of topology about the brain. We know a lot about the individual neurons, about the way signals are propagated in electrical or neurochemical form. We have a certain idea and understanding what, on the other hand, for example, for consciousness, what individual functions could be. It is agreed that we don't know anything about the topological side here, but we can estimate how such functions could be implemented given the patterns in between them. For example, a simple gateway pattern, for example, a slow decay pattern, or something more complex in, for example, language analysis. But in the same way, we could do visual analysis and also audio analysis. It becomes clear that apparently the knowledge lies in the topology, and from that we have to conclude back that our experience, our learning, which is based on real-world data from our senses, must necessarily implement the topology, and thus actually implement the types of synapses and the form of connections that we have. This is one of the fundamental discussion points in the evolution of the brain, because we all agree that to a degree what we know is learned in our lifetime, but to another part it is also obviously influenced by our genes, by our ability to learn something actually. So it appears that there are two degrees of freedom, one of them being the disposition, and the other one being the actual learning. Unfortunately, there is only little we know about how these functions actually work. However, I think it becomes clear from the discussion that we just had that these two things must exist simultaneously. There is a lot of discussion and scientific discourse going on. Some arguing that everything can be explained by learning, in particular in the semantic field of language understanding and picking up languages in growing up. And others point out clearly that disposition is also very important, that you must have a disposition. One of the major actors in that discussion was, for example, Noam Chomsky, who took a very extreme point of view in that respect by claiming that disposition is actually the more important part for language learning. The truth probably is somewhere in the middle. We need both functions. What we should be interested in, and what you should try to focus also in the seminar, is on how topology can be influenced by learning, because this is, in my opinion, the central and big miracle left in understanding the human brain. Thank you.